You're sitting peacefully, scrolling through your phone after a long day at work. The house is quiet, you're finally relaxed, and everything feels calm. Then she walks in with that particular tone in her voice. Not quite angry, not exactly upset, but carrying just enough edge to make your stomach tighten. "Did you remember to take out the trash?" she asks, but it's not really a question. It's a loaded statement wrapped in interrogative packaging, designed to trigger something in you that she can then amplify and reflect back, until you're both screaming about things that have nothing to do with garbage. You feel that familiar spike of irritation. Here we go again. You weren't trying to forget the trash, you were planning to do it after dinner, but now it's become evidence of your thoughtlessness, your lack of consideration, your pattern of making her handle everything. And just like that, you're arguing about trash when the real issue is something neither of you will admit. She's manufacturing conflict, and you're taking the bait every single time. Today, I'm going to decode the psychological machinery that women use to transform minor irritations into major conflicts, and more importantly, how to become immune to these manipulation tactics that turn your peaceful evening into emotional warfare. Women have mastered spark amplification, taking tiny moments of friction and growing them into blazing conflicts. The amplification works through emotional multiplication, where your slight irritation becomes her major concern, which becomes your defensive reaction, which becomes her escalated response. This system exploits male psychology that tries to solve problems through logical discussion. You think you're addressing her concerns when you're actually feeding fuel to an emotional fire designed to burn, not be extinguished. The system works by making you complicit in your own emotional manipulation. Your natural responses to being provoked provide the raw material that she transforms into evidence of your insensitivity or communication problems. Understanding this amplification allows you to recognize when small issues are being transformed into large conflicts for purposes that have nothing to do with resolving the original issue. Women are masters at weaponizing tone, using subtle vocal inflections and emotional undertones to create maximum psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability about their aggressive intentions. Tone weaponization operates below conscious awareness, triggering emotional reactions before you realize you're being manipulated. The same words can be delivered with completely different emotional impacts depending on the tone used. The weaponization works by embedding criticism, accusation, or judgment within seemingly neutral statements. "Did you remember to take out the trash?" becomes a statement about your reliability. "How was your day?" becomes an evaluation of your emotional availability. This tonal manipulation is particularly effective because it's difficult to address directly without seeming oversensitive. When you respond to the tone rather than the content, you appear to be overreacting to innocent questions. Learning to recognize tone weaponization allows you to respond to what's actually happening, rather than pretending that aggressive communication is neutral just because it's packaged politely. The manipulation process operates through a precise psychological chain. Provocative input generates specific thoughts. Thoughts create emotions. Emotions drive actions that provide material for further manipulation. When she uses that particular tone about the trash, she's planting thoughts like, "She thinks I'm irresponsible," or "Here we go with the criticism again." These thoughts immediately generate corresponding emotions: irritation, defensiveness, resentment. The emotions then drive your actions: defensive explanations, counter-accusations, or attempts to justify your behavior. These actions provide exactly the response she was seeking, giving her material to escalate the conflict further. Breaking this chain requires intercepting it at the thought level before emotions are generated. When you recognize that your initial thoughts are being manufactured by someone else's strategic behavior, you can choose different thoughts that generate different emotions. The chain-breaking process involves developing mental vigilance, constant awareness of your internal dialogue, and the ability to redirect unhelpful thoughts before they create emotional and behavioral consequences. Developing immunity to manipulation requires maintaining constant awareness of your thoughts, because emotions stem from thoughts, and certain thoughts predictably lead to emotional states that make you vulnerable to manipulation. The protocol involves catching dangerous thoughts while they're small. "I shouldn't have to deal with this. Here we go again." Or "Can't I have peace in my own house?" These thoughts create impatience that seeps into your tone, providing material for escalation. When you recognize these thoughts, challenge them immediately. "Who says you shouldn't have to deal with this? Why shouldn't you?" You're dealing with reality as it is, not as you wish it were. This mental discipline prevents emotional reactivity that feeds manipulation cycles. Behind every feeling is a thought, and rooting out problematic thoughts while they're small prevents having to cope with them emotionally later. The discipline also involves expectation management, accepting that reality often doesn't match your preferences without allowing that gap to create frustration that others can exploit. Every man has psychological buttons, emotional triggers that create predictable reactions when activated. Women become experts at discovering and cataloguing these buttons because understanding your emotional vulnerabilities gives them strategic advantages in relationship dynamics. The discovery happens gradually through trial and error. She makes various comments while watching your reactions. The responses that create emotional intensity get noted and filed away for future use when she needs emotional leverage or to shift power dynamics. Your buttons might relate to your competence, attractiveness, success, family, or past relationships. Once discovered, these become reliable tools for creating emotional reactions when she wants them. The button pushing isn't always conscious or deliberately malicious. Many women operate on instinct when they want attention or emotional engagement. They've learned that pushing certain buttons guarantees response, which feels like connection even when it's actually conflict. Understanding that your buttons are being discovered and catalogued allows you to work on removing them, rather than just managing reactions to them being pushed. Instead of viewing conflicts as problems to be avoided, reframe them as training opportunities for developing emotional resilience and psychological immunity to manipulation. This transforms irritating experiences into valuable learning opportunities. The emotional gym concept recognizes that you cannot develop emotional strength without encountering emotional challenges. Just as physical muscles need resistance to grow stronger, emotional muscles need provocation to develop resilience. Every time someone tries to push your buttons, you have an opportunity to practice not letting those buttons control your response. Each incident of manufactured drama becomes a chance to strengthen your immunity to emotional manipulation tactics. This framework removes victim mentality that makes conflicts feel overwhelming and personal. Instead of feeling attacked, you feel challenged. Instead of feeling manipulated, you feel trained. The gym framework also prevents you from taking emotional manipulation personally, because you understand that it's revealing information about your psychological vulnerabilities rather than your actual worth. Developing immunity to female manipulation works exactly like building tolerance to poison. You must expose yourself to increasingly stronger doses of provocation, while maintaining emotional control until even sophisticated manipulation attempts have no effect. This immunity protocol begins with minor provocations, where you practice maintaining emotional equilibrium despite attempts to trigger reactive responses. Small manipulation attempts allow you to develop psychological defenses. The protocol requires gradually increasing exposure to more intense manipulation tactics, while maintaining commitment to emotional regulation and frame control. Each successful navigation without reactive response strengthens immunity to future attempts. Without gradual exposure and immunity building, you remain vulnerable to being overwhelmed by even minor manipulation attempts. Men who avoid all conflict thinking they're protecting themselves actually weaken their capacity to handle inevitable challenges. The immunity makes you increasingly attractive to psychologically healthy women, while making you uninteresting to women who depend on emotional reactivity for relationship control. Perhaps the most psychologically disarming response to manipulation attempts is expressing genuine gratitude for the information being provided about your remaining emotional vulnerabilities. This reversal completely disrupts the expected dynamic. When someone successfully pushes your buttons, respond with appreciation. Thank you for showing me I still have that trigger. I didn't realize I was still vulnerable there. This is valuable information for my development. This gratitude response is powerful because it's the opposite of what emotional manipulators expect. They're ready for anger or defensiveness. They're not prepared for genuine appreciation for their inadvertent contribution to your self-awareness. The technique prevents you from becoming a victim because you're extracting value from the experience rather than just enduring damage. You're using their provocation as raw material for psychological development. The reversal must be genuine rather than sarcastic to be effective. You must actually appreciate the learning opportunity rather than performing appreciation as counter-manipulation. When you successfully eliminate emotional buttons and become immune to manipulation tactics that previously worked, Manipulative people typically escalate their efforts to find new vulnerabilities or confirm that your immunity is genuine. This testing intensification is predictable and should be expected. When she can no longer trigger your usual emotional responses, she may increase intensity, frequency, or creativity of manipulation, attempts to test whether your immunity holds under greater pressure. The intensification might involve more sensitive topics, timing provocations when you're stressed, enlisting others to support her positions, or creating artificial crises that test your commitment to emotional regulation under extreme pressure. Understanding that intensification is coming helps you prepare psychologically, rather than being caught off guard. The testing phase is actually final examination of your psychological development. Most men fail during this phase because they're unprepared for escalation and interpret it as evidence that their emotional regulation isn't working, rather than recognizing it as proof that regulation is working so well that more extreme measures are being deployed. Successfully navigating the testing phase typically results in the manipulator giving up, because they realize you cannot be controlled through emotional tactics. The ultimate level involves becoming a master, someone who can transform any interaction, even manipulation attempts, into opportunities for demonstrating wisdom and emotional maturity while helping others grow. The master's approach isn't just immunity, it's transformation of the entire dynamic into something beneficial. Instead of simply not reacting to manipulation, the master uses manipulation attempts as teaching moments. This mastery involves understanding that manipulative behavior usually stems from fear or insecurity rather than genuine malice. The master can address underlying needs while refusing to participate in dysfunctional expressions of those needs. The master can turn even disrespectful people into opportunities for developing patience and emotional resilience. Every challenging person becomes a teacher. Every difficult situation becomes training. This development is attractive because it demonstrates emotional leadership that creates safety and growth opportunities for others while maintaining your psychological well-being and relationship standards. You're sitting peacefully, scrolling through your phone after a long day at work. The house is quiet, you're finally relaxed, and everything feels calm. Then she walks in with that particular tone in her voice. Not quite angry, not exactly upset, but carrying just enough edge to make your stomach tighten. "Did you remember to take out the trash?" she asks. But it's not really a question. It's a loaded statement wrapped in interrogative packaging, designed to trigger something in you that she can then amplify and reflect back until you're both screaming about things that have nothing to do with garbage. You feel that familiar spike of irritation. Here we go again. You weren't trying to forget the trash, you were planning to do it after dinner. But now it's become evidence of your thoughtlessness, your lack of consideration, your pattern of making her handle everything. And just like that, you're arguing about trash when the real issue is something neither of you will admit. She's manufacturing conflict, and you're taking the bait every single time. Today, I'm going to decode the psychological machinery that women use to transform minor irritations into major conflicts, and more importantly, how to become immune to these manipulation tactics that turn your peaceful evening into emotional warfare. The most dangerous conflicts in relationships don't start with major issues. They begin with tiny catalysts that most men dismiss as insignificant. A particular tone, a loaded question, a subtle criticism embedded in casual conversation. Like a forest fire that can burn down thousands of acres from a single spark, entire relationships can be destroyed by conflicts that started with something trivial. Men make the critical error of thinking these small catalysts don't matter because they seem so minor compared to real relationship problems. But this thinking ignores a fundamental principle. It's always easier to address problems when they're small than after they've grown roots and spread throughout the entire relationship dynamic. The spark system works because women understand that men's guards are down when the issue seems insignificant. You don't prepare psychologically for major conflict over minor issues, which makes you vulnerable to emotional manipulation disguised as casual conversation. Every small irritation that you allow to pass without addressing becomes ammunition for future conflicts. She learns which buttons to push, which topics create emotional reactions, and which timing produces maximum psychological impact. The prevention of forest fires requires vigilance about small sparks before they become uncontrollable blazes. Similarly, preventing relationship warfare requires addressing manipulative communication patterns before they establish themselves as normal relationship dynamics. Understanding the spark principle transforms how you respond to seemingly minor provocations. Instead of dismissing them as insignificant, you recognize them as early warning systems that require immediate attention to prevent escalation. Most men believe that understanding problematic behavior will somehow resolve it. This creates an addiction to solving people rather than evaluating compatibility. When she behaves in ways that create conflict or discomfort, your first instinct is to investigate why, rather than deciding whether you want to tolerate that behavior. The addiction manifests as obsessive need to decode every behavior, analyze every response, and trace every pattern back to its psychological origin. You become convinced that somewhere in her history lies the key that will unlock the version of her that can actually meet your relationship needs. This keeps you trapped in situations any rational observer would tell you to leave, because you're always hoping your next breakthrough in understanding will finally produce the behavioural changes you've been waiting for. You mistake psychological insight for progress toward your actual goals. Understanding addiction also provides socially acceptable reasons to remain in dysfunctional situations. Instead of admitting you're staying because you're afraid to be alone or lack better options, you frame persistence as compassion or emotional intelligence. The cruel irony is that the more you understand about why she can't give you what you need, the less likely you become to demand what you deserve. Understanding breeds tolerance for intolerable behaviour rather than motivating you to seek better treatment. Breaking this addiction requires recognising that behavioural patterns are information about character, rather than puzzles to be solved through analysis. Use that information to make decisions about compatibility, rather than developing treatment plans for others' psychological issues. Men approach relationship problems using a medical model that assumes identifying causes automatically leads to resolution. When someone has cancer, doctors focus on treatment rather than investigating origins for months. But in relationships, men become obsessed with psychological archaeology of problematic behaviours. She's emotionally unavailable, so you investigate her attachment history. She's manipulative, so you research her childhood trauma. She's unreliable, so you analyse her previous relationships for clues about her trust issues. This medical model creates the illusion that psychological problems will automatically resolve once their origins are understood and processed. But behavioural patterns that have existed for years don't disappear through insight alone. They require sustained effort and motivation to change. The model also positions you as her unpaid therapist rather than her romantic partner, fundamentally altering the relationship dynamic in ways that serve her comfort while undermining your satisfaction. More importantly, this approach ignores the crucial question of whether she's actually motivated to change the behaviours causing problems in your relationship. Understanding why she acts a certain way is irrelevant if she has no intention of acting differently. The medical model trap keeps you focused on causes rather than solutions, origins rather than outcomes, and theoretical understanding rather than practical improvement in your relationship experience. The core dynamic of female conflict creation operates through a specific mechanism. If you give a woman a little irritation, she'll grow it into aggravation and reflect it back to you with compound interest. After few exchanges like this, you're engaged in full emotional warfare over issues that started as minor inconveniences. This amplification serves multiple functions. It creates drama and intensity that can feel like passion and emotional connection. It establishes her emotional state as the primary concern that must be addressed immediately. It forces you to prove your care through willingness to engage with her emotional processing. The mechanism is particularly effective because it makes you complicit in your own manipulation. Your natural responses to being provoked provide the raw material that she transforms into evidence of your insensitivity, communication problems, or lack of emotional intelligence. The only way to prevent this amplification is to provide nothing that can be grown and reflected back. If your communication is completely devoid of negativity, impatience, or irritation, there's no emotional raw material for her to amplify into larger conflicts. This requires maintaining what could be called emotional neutrality, even when facing provocative behaviour. You respond to the content of communication without providing emotional charge that can be captured and amplified. Understanding this mechanism allows you to recognise when you're being baited into providing emotional reactions that will be used against you in escalating conflict cycles. Here's the crucial question that reveals whether you're psychologically prepared for relationship challenges. If you can't tolerate the initial small provocation without becoming emotionally reactive, how will you handle the amplified version that gets reflected back to you? This tolerance test exposes a fundamental weakness in male psychology. Men often believe they can handle major challenges while failing completely at minor provocations. But small irritations that aren't managed properly always become large conflicts that are much more difficult to navigate. The tolerance problem reveals itself in your inability to maintain emotional equilibrium when faced with behaviour that violates your expectations about how you should be treated. Your intolerance of minor discomfort sets you up for major emotional disruption. Building tolerance requires accepting that some level of provocation is inevitable in any relationship, and that your capacity to handle these challenges without reactive behaviour determines whether conflicts escalate or dissipate naturally. The tolerance challenge also involves developing patience with reality, as it is, rather than demanding that reality conform to your preferences about how it should be. This expectation management eliminates much of the frustration that feeds manipulation cycles. Tolerance doesn't mean accepting abuse or poor treatment. It means maintaining emotional stability while addressing problematic behaviour through calm, clear communication rather than reactive emotional responses. Instead of viewing manipulative behaviour as attacks to be defended against, consider the women who push your buttons as teachers who are inadvertently showing you where you still have psychological work to do. This reframing transforms adversarial dynamics into educational opportunities. When someone successfully triggers emotional reaction in you, they're providing valuable information about your remaining psychological vulnerabilities. She's showing you exactly where you need to develop stronger emotional defenses in the safety of your relationship, rather than discovering these weaknesses in higher stakes situations. This teaching isn't usually malicious. In most cases, her motivation isn't to harm you, but to get attention, create engagement, or test your emotional stability. Even if the motivation were malicious, she can still serve as your teacher about your own psychological development needs. The teacher framework prevents you from taking manipulation personally, because you understand that it reveals more about your internal state than about her character or intentions. You're learning about yourself rather than being attacked by someone else. This approach requires gratitude for lessons, even unwanted ones. When you can genuinely appreciate information about your psychological vulnerabilities, you transform manipulation attempts into growth opportunities rather than relationship problems. The teacher recognition also helps you maintain emotional equilibrium during difficult interactions because you're focused on learning rather than defending yourself or trying to change their behaviour. The ultimate goal isn't just managing your reactions to button pushing, but eliminating the buttons entirely so that manipulation attempts have no psychological targets to activate. This elimination process involves identifying and removing the triggers that others can use to control your emotional state. When you feel buttons being pushed, immediately implement mental discipline to prevent emotional fluorescence. If emotion presents itself despite your efforts, use emotional coping strategies to prevent that emotion from affecting your tone or behaviour. Later, when you have time and space, examine what happened. Ask yourself why you have that particular button. Why did that comment affect your ego? What belief, insecurity, or wound is that trigger connected to? The removal process involves healing underlying psychological foundations that make certain provocations effective. When you address the root cause of your emotional vulnerability, the button disappears permanently rather than just being temporarily managed. Button elimination also requires developing self-worth that's independent of external validation. When your sense of value comes from internal sources, others' attempts to diminish you through criticism or provocation become irrelevant to your psychological state. The goal is becoming buttonless, or at least removing specific buttons from commission, so that manipulation attempts find no psychological targets to activate. After you've successfully eliminated emotional buttons and demonstrated immunity to standard manipulation tactics, expect intensified testing to confirm whether your immunity is genuine or temporary. This testing phase is crucial to navigate successfully. The next time she goes looking for buttons that no longer exist, she'll push harder to make sure they're really gone. When she can't find familiar triggers, she may escalate intensity, try new approaches, or create artificial crises to test your emotional regulation under extreme pressure. You must be prepared for this intensification rather than being surprised when it occurs. The testing phase is actually validation that your psychological development is working so effectively that more extreme measures are being deployed to find remaining vulnerabilities. After she realizes the buttons are genuinely gone and cannot be reactivated through increased pressure, she'll typically stop pushing entirely because the behaviour no longer serves its intended purpose of creating emotional reactions. This final phase determines whether you've achieved genuine immunity or just temporary improvement. If you can maintain emotional regulation during intensified testing, you've developed authentic psychological strength rather than just better self-control techniques. Successfully completing the testing phase usually results in dramatically improved relationship dynamics, because manipulation tactics are abandoned in favour of direct communication when emotional manipulation proves ineffective. The testing phase also filters relationships. Women who are primarily interested in emotional control often lose interest when that control becomes impossible, while women who prefer healthy communication are attracted to your emotional stability and maturity. The fundamental truth about female manipulation is that it only works when men provide the emotional reactions that manipulation depends on for success. Without your reactive participation, manipulation tactics fail automatically, and the manipulator typically moves on to more responsive targets. This immunity isn't about becoming cold or emotionally unavailable. It's about developing emotional regulation skills that allow you to respond rather than react, to choose your emotional states rather than having them chosen for you. The men who master this immunity discover that their relationships improve dramatically because they're no longer participating in toxic dynamics that poison most male-female interactions. They become attractive to psychologically healthy women while becoming unattractive to women who depend on drama for emotional stimulation. Your emotional buttons are not permanent features. They're learned responses that can be unlearned through conscious effort and practice. Every manipulation attempt becomes an opportunity to strengthen immunity rather than evidence that you're being victimized. Understanding how manipulation works doesn't require you to tolerate it or try to heal the people who use it against you. Understanding provides the knowledge necessary to protect yourself while making informed decisions about who deserves access to your emotional energy. The men who develop this immunity become naturally attractive leaders in their relationships because they provide emotional stability that allows others to feel safe being authentic rather than manipulative. They create environments where healthy communication thrives while manipulation tactics fail. Share this analysis with any man who's tired of being emotionally manipulated through manufactured conflicts and wants to understand that immunity to manipulation is developed through emotional mastery rather than relationship avoidance.